So in creating this documentary, we interviewed a lot of people, and Frank had a lot of opportunities to ask me questions, and we asked a lot of other people questions. But right now, Frank, I want to ask you a question. You'll have a chance, to ask me some more afterwards. But first, I want to ask you, what scene or interview stood out the most to you and had the most significant impact on the film, in your view?
In Steinholtsgjá, the canyon at the glacier, Steinholtsjökull. That is the glacier from the first scene. We went in the canyon where the glacier used to be, and it was very visible. We could really imagine that we were standing in a spot where the glacier used to be.
Just actually look up and realize that all this distance above you used to be ice. That's a really weird feeling.
So this particular scene, I believe, was a huge impact on the creative process, is because even though it was early on in the creative process, it was a moment where we started seeing more of you as a character rather than a presenter. We start to see your emotions come through, your frustration, start seeing maybe some development of thoughts or angles. For me, that was very important because I started to see okay, I think this is actually very interesting to see this on camera, see this happen. Then I started thinking we need to try and find more of that.
For me, building upon that moment, the most significant scene in the film was when we spoke to Thori, this environmental humanist. I focused so much, and always have, on beauty. And I think that's such an important thing that people should be connected to. And when there's this person, we're standing at the edge of a glacier that's beautiful and overlooking this lagoon, and he's saying to me, to my face, this is beautiful, but so what?
The reliance on aesthetic is a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
People might say, yes, it's beautiful, but so what? I mean, what does beauty mean?
For me, in that moment, film-wise and, self-realization, it kind of was this aha of, I get it. It has to be a bit more than that. It has to be more than just what I had always been referring to in my photography, and what maybe other creatives are also focusing on, is this aesthetic and this beauty. And it felt weird, to incorporate myself as a character into the film, but that's when it made sense to me to, okay, I can be a bit vulnerable and, bring this into there to hopefully bring across this lesson to other people to get, the impact from that.
All right, next question.
Okay, so what was the most challenging part of making this film for you?
Good question. I don't think there was huge technical challenges in this film. I mean, there was some hiking here and there, but climate change is a very big topic, and everything is linked. Everything is so connected and so important as well. We didn't want to make a film, covering climate change. We didn't want to cover a film losing the glaciers, because there's glaciers all over the world, not only in Iceland. So multiple times we kept on expanding it and going into more, and that would then again it would freeze us. We would get overwhelmed by it. And so multiple times we had to bring it back. What's the Icelandic story? And really what is our story? I think that was one of the biggest challenges.
For me, I think one of the greatest challenges was, considering the whole topic, and for me, being emotionally connected to this concept of change. It was difficult for me to overcome this, focus that I had on aesthetic and on beauty. And there were so many times throughout the film that I wanted to keep falling back into that niche of where I, as a photographer, have been, zoning in on that and trying to get people to care about this large topic through beautiful things. And this process of wearing down that concept in my own mind was a challenge for me, because I was so comfortable and attached to that. And the whole process of the film was a challenge that resulted in a lesson that I've learned, and that we both learned, that we have to be narrow and focused, keeping things personal, but also trying to be as objective and taking the advice of all the people that we incorporated it into the film together as one to get the message across.
How challenging was that for you to be in front of the camera and show the personal aspect?
Well, both of us had these dilemmas all the time, right? And we're both focusing on these issues that we're having difficulty dealing with, and we're feeling overwhelmed, and we're feeling anxiety, and we're not sure where to go. And we had paralysis so many times throughout this whole documentary creation process. And to be even the smallest bit vulnerable feels, there's fear in that. And I think I had, before we really turned the camera around, I had this enormous fear of, people would just look at me and think, oh, what's wrong with him or something. But in reality, this is what a lot of people are facing, this challenge of, anxiety and depression and being not able to connect to the issue because we're overwhelmed by it. And then realizing that this is actually a powerful tool to communicate to people, to get them to relate to it, to hopefully overcome it themselves. Because I feel now more empowered, and I think we both feel empowered. Though the camera wasn't necessarily on you, we both shared that sort of, being enabled by the creative process and that challenge and overcoming it. For me, it was difficult. So although you didn't face the challenge of being in front of the camera, what was one of the challenges or some of the challenges you faced behind the camera?
I think the biggest challenge was that like every scene, every location was different, like different weather, different terrain, sometimes physically more intense, hiking, bringing all the gear with us on a hiking trail or up a mountain, but also like a lot of unexpected moments or things that we couldn't 100% plan. Like when we went up with the scientists onto the glacier, we'd never been there. We didn't really know what to expect. So like once we were up there, you suddenly realize, this scene, if you don't show the context around it, literally being on that glacier just looks like a snowy landscape. Suddenly you're like, oh, I thought this was gonna look like a glacier. And then I realized these particular shots, people wouldn't recognize that it's a glacier. But you only realize that when you're, in that spot. Or other times we would go somewhere and then the conversation is happening, and you got to capture that. And then as a cameraman, you got to make sure that you still, make it interesting while you're filming, while you're doing it. Like you can only walk up a mountain a couple of times. You can't keep going. So I think that's like the challenge in this film was mostly being quick or with responding and finding solutions for whatever challenge we were facing.
So another question for you, Frank, is during the filmmaking process, were there any sort of moments that ended up unexpected from how we intended to film them?
I think there was one particular scene, the one where we went up on a glacier with the scientists. So that day, a bunch of scientists were doing a biannual measurement on the glacier, going, all of the glacier, measuring different spots, and they invited us to come along. So we were very excited to really go on this crazy adventure, crossing the glacier. But we only got to one measurement point, which was like, it was like the closest to the edge of the glacier, That was as far as we could get, because the snow turned out much softer than expected. We all got stuck around that first measurement point. We also barely made it there. We were climbing up a hill like super slow, digging ourselves in the snow, trying to get out again. So once we did that first measurement, we then decided to return because it didn't make sense. And the head scientist, he was planning on continuing with a snowcat, because there was a bunch of others on snow scooters or whatever you call them. So the cars were definitely not going to make it, but there were other tools. But then later we found out that even the snowcat broke down during that mission.
The whole night.
The whole night, yeah. And he actually stayed there way longer than expected. I remember him telling us, like, I keep going until like everything is done. And it was even longer than he expected, I think. Yeah. But we were lucky to still, get what we needed.
So for me, I recall the situation when we were interviewing Loive. She's an older Icelandic woman, doesn't speak English, and we had her daughter there translating. The questions that we were asking, it didn't seem as though we were getting the responses that we'd hoped for, to incorporate this wisdom of, someone who's generations before us that we wanted to put into the film. And even when reviewing it, we felt a little bit like, okay, I don't know if we can use this interview. It doesn't really have the context or the content that we really wanted. It was only until later when we sat down with a native Icelandic speaker and literally went word for word through the interview responses did we discover how funny and witty and inspiring this interview actually was, this character Loive.
Like they say, lost in translation.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
So Frank, I have a final question for you. Was there any sort of takeaways or lessons from the filmmaking process for you that you can share with us?
I think a big lesson in the making of this film was to go out and put people in an environment. Interviews can be very interesting, but I think it's much more interesting when you put a person in an environment so it can respond to the environment, it can interact with the environment, and that actually makes the process of, you know, telling a visual story, it makes that process much easier, rather than trying to fix things with B-roll over a nice interview. You know, even though you can do like really cool lighting setups and creating a scene for an interview, I think it just gets lost. It's not a radio show. You're making a film. So I think that like creating scenes was something I learned from this film.
For me, one lesson and takeaway from creating this film was the power of collaboration and incorporating already existing ideas and combining them to be able to communicate such a difficult issue. You know, working with people like Kieran Baxter to incorporate the work that he's already done with doing repeat photography. At the beginning, that was my idea to incorporate that into the film, but discovering that he had already done it and combining that with our already existing storyline, we're able to, you know, remix his concept with other people's ideas about, you know, climate change and how to communicate with that to create a totally new message. And for me, that's an important thing to consider, that, you know, if you have an idea or a concept, you don't have to just do it by yourself, but you can work with other people to remix it and reinvent it and get the message across in a more powerful way.
Nice.
Good.
Yeah, man.
Okay, very good.
Cool. Thanks.